Good morning. Okay. I'd like to thank the pastor for inviting me to preach as your guest preacher today. It's very nice to be here. It's been a long time. Thank you for your patience and understanding during the time that I have been away from the pulpit. I've been here at church, of course. Enjoyed. In fact, it's sometimes good to just be in the congregation and just be part of the worship there. So that's been, I must say, a bit of a blessing during the time where I just really wasn't up to preaching, and that's maybe you got the email as well, so you know explanation of what's been going on. So anyway, this is the time preaching this week, and then we'll be going away on holidays. So actually our last week here at Ferntree Gully before going away. So I'm going to preach 2 hours to make the most of it. Amen. Might go longer with that encouragement. King George VI, at a dire time after the beginning of World War II, he called for a national day of prayer. Hard to imagine in this day and age that a leader would call for a day of prayer, but he did. And this was the video report of it, that when it was given afterwards, hopefully. Okay.
The Empire responds to the King's call. And at Westminster Abbey, heart of the Empire, the statesmen, the soldiers, the ambassadors, and hundreds of ordinary men and women join the mighty congregation. Her Majesty Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands arrives a few moments before their Majesties. No one here today could foresee the grave news that has come from Belgium. All the more, it is well for us to show the world that we still believe in divine guidance, in the laws of Christianity. May we find inspiration and faith from this solemn day.
Interesting, isn't it? During the time there was the Allies, and especially the British Army, were trapped at Dunkirk. And so the King called for a national day of prayer. Now, how quickly people forget about the Christian roots. He said, we're letting the nations know we still believe in divine power. Nowadays, I checked, only 5% of people in England go to church. 5%. It's become very, very secular. Yet, during the time of war, now obviously the times were different, the crowds turned out for the National Day of Prayer at that time. And so, yeah, as I say, it was especially because of the army. Around about 350-odd thousand were trapped at Dunkirk, and the Germans were closing in very, very rapidly. And so there was a time of national prayer. So what was the result? What was the result of this National Day of Prayer? Let's have a look and see.
On May 10th, 1940, Winston Churchill took office as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. This was a crucial early moment in the Second World War, as Germany had turned its attention to enacting blitzkrieg across Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. On May 16th, the Allied forces in France were caught off guard by the German panzer divisions, which circumvented the Maginot Line by driving through the Ardennes forest. What followed was a hasty retreat for the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, and other Allied forces. After suffering a heavy onslaught at the hands of the advancing German army, the troops were stranded on the beach at Dunkirk. Initial attempts to rescue the encircled army proved to be too slow, with only 39 British and 4 Canadian Royal Navy destroyers. It became obvious to the Admiralty that the evacuation needed support, and so the public were called upon to lend a hand. From May 26th until June 4th, 1940, the evacuation of the Allied forces at Dunkirk, codenamed Operation Dynamo, took place. In the end, a fleet of over 800 boats, consisting of fishing vessels to pleasure yachts, helped to evacuate over 338,000 soldiers, when initial estimates had predicted that less than 45,000 could possibly be saved. One of the most decisive factors in the survival of almost 85% of the Allied soldiers was the overcast and still weather. There was low-lying cloud for the majority of the evacuation. The usually choppy waters of the English Channel were described as a mill pond. And on the UK's Met Office website, the events surrounding Dunkirk are explained and weather reports are included. The Met Office writes, somewhere among those awaiting evacuation at Dunkirk were meteorological officers who had been working with sound ranging units attached to the survey regiments. Their task was to determine the direction and distance of enemy gunfire, to assist with artillery operations. It is not known which ship they were evacuated on, but the unusually calm weather was certainly in their favor and played a significant part in what was later described by Churchill as the miracle of Dunkirk. These conditions hampered the Luftwaffe from its aerial bombardment and enabled the flotilla of vessels to rescue the soldiers. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, who was responsible for the evacuation, later wrote, "It must be fully realized that a wind of any strength in the northern sector between the southwest and the northeast would have made beach evacuation impossible. What would Europe look like today if the weather had been behaving normally? The Luftwaffe would have achieved air superiority, and the German panzer divisions would have continued their blitzkrieg tactics, closed out the Western Front, and defeated the bulk of the British Army." The Met Office website provides statistical odds for the unusual weather in May-June 1940. The maximum wind recorded throughout the evacuation was force 4, or 13 knots. And on most days, it varied between forces 1 and 3, which is 2 to 9 knots. The odds of winds greater than force 4 in the Dunkirk area in May and June are slightly higher than 2 to 1. In any case, the Allied forces were evacuated to safety due to the mercifully still waters of the Channel and the miraculous fog above them. Was the weather for those 3 days merely happenstance? Or was there, as Churchill once said, some great purpose and design being worked out here below?
Isn't that interesting? When the British were really under the hammer, they had a huge army there stuck at Dunkirk. They had the National Day of Prayer, and then God intervened and the weather hampered the Germans and allowed also the evacuations. A lot of things had to go right with the weather in order to do that. And so today we're going to be looking at a story when prayer in Bible times was no less dramatic. It was about the extermination or the potential extermination of all of the Jews. So it was not a small time or not something that was of little consequence that was happening in the book of Esther. These were momentous events in the history of the Jewish people. However, unlike George VI, who called for prayer to God to let people know we were still a Christian nation, somewhat surprisingly, the book of Esther does not mention prayer or God. It doesn't mention prayer or God. Now, a couple of years ago, when Joe Biden announced the annual National Day of Prayer, he didn't mention God, and there was an outcry. But here in the book of Esther, no mention of God's name and no mention of prayer, despite the huge and momentous events. So anyway, let's have a bit of a look. Guys, have a bit of a look, because Esther is actually a book that, as Christians, as Seventh-day Adventists, we ought to be concentrating on just as much as Daniel, in fact. In fact, I'm going to be doing a series on Esther in the new year. Okay, let's go to Esther chapter 3, verses 1 to 11. Okay, Esther chapter 3, verses 1 to 11. Okay. Ezra, just after the book of Nehemiah. Esther, after the book of Nehemiah. So, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Chapter 3, verses 1 to 11. Okay, let's set the scene a bit. Okay, third chapter of Esther. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, over all the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down and show him respect. Then the palace officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" They spoke to him day after day, but still he refused to comply with the order. So they spoke to Haman about this to see if he would tolerate Mordecai's conduct, since Mordecai had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. Okay, this was no small thing that was happening. Haman was an Agagite. Okay, you might be wondering who or what are Agagites. Well, Agagite was the king of the Amalekites. And Saul was supposed to destroy all of them, okay? But they continued. He didn't do that. He failed to obey the command of the Lord. And so the Jews and the Amalekites, they were sort of sworn enemies. And so this man, Haman, he was an Agagite. Now, we're not entirely sure why Mordecai didn't bow down to him. Just out of respect. The Bible doesn't actually tell us why. That's one possible reason why he didn't do that. I don't believe there was any religious objection or anything like that, bowing down to show respect. Plenty of people in the Bible, including God's people, bowed down to show respect to people. But yeah, for some reason, Mordecai did not bow down to Haman, and this made him very, very angry. And so it says there in verse 6, quite chilling words, that he decided not just to go after Mordecai, but to go after an entire nationality and race of people. Unbelievable that someone would think along those lines. Just because of a slight of one person, let's get rid of all of them. So, very, very harsh and quite chilling. Okay, let's continue in verse 7. So in the month of April, during the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign, lots were cast in Haman's presence. The lots were called Purim, to determine the best day and month to take action. And the day selected was March 7, nearly a year later. And so the Jews today still celebrate the festival of Purim. Okay, and it basically means lots. Okay, the Haman cast lots to determine what's the best day to kill everybody, as you do. Okay, so you cast lots, and that's why it's called Purim, after the word for lots, for casting lots. So, by chance, which day they would kill everybody. Okay, let's continue reading at verse 8. Sorry, it's actually making a lot of noise. Verse 8. Then Haman approached the king Xerxes and said, "There is a certain race of people scattered throughout all the provinces of your empire, who keep themselves separate from everyone else. Their laws are different from those of any other people, and they refuse to obey the laws of the king. So it is not in the king's interest to let them live. If it pleases the king, issue a decree that they may be destroyed, and I will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators to be deposited in the royal treasury." I don't know what sort of king this was, that he didn't sort of make further inquiries about, how many people are we talking about? What are they doing that's so bad? It's quite glib what's going on here. Haman wants all the Jews destroyed because of one person not showing him respect. The king just seems to be going along with it, doesn't ask any questions or whatever. Just says, okay, go ahead and keep your money. It doesn't really matter. Do what you like with these people. Just so casual. what's going on here? We're talking about so many people's lives, yet there seems to be no respect or anything like that, or finding out more information that the king doesn't seem to do. So anyway, the king agrees to do that. The king's in verse 11. The king said, "The money and the people are both yours to do with as you see fit." So obviously he had a lot of trust in Haman, that he just let him do whatever without making further inquiries. And so, this sets the scene for what's going on. So the Jews are going to be destroyed on a certain date, about a year roughly from when they were, from when it's written. So there's plenty of warning. It's not something that's going to happen in a few days or whatever, but almost a year later, the day was appointed for them. So what do you do? What do you do? Okay, we'll fast forward to Esther chapter 4, verses 1 to 14. When Mordecai learned about all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on burlap and ashes, and went into the city, crying with a loud and a bitter wail. He went as far as the gate of the palace, for no one was allowed to enter the palace gate while wearing clothes of mourning. And as news of the king's decree reached all the provinces, there was great mourning among the Jews. They fasted, wept, and wailed, and many people lay in burlap and ashes. When Queen Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was deeply distressed. She sent clothing to him to replace the burlap, but he refused it. Then Esther sent for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed as her attendant. She ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what was troubling him and why he was in mourning. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the square in front of the palace gate. Mordecai told him the whole story, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree issued in Susa that called for the death of all Jews. He asked Hathach to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. He also asked Hathach to direct her to go to the king, to beg for mercy and plead for her people. So Hathach returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. Queen Esther was also a Jew, so she was also in the firing line of this decree. And so Mordecai, who was her uncle, he went and sent this message to Queen Esther and to tell her what was going on and about this decree that was made. And so the eunuch reports back to Queen Esther. Okay, let's continue reading verses 10 to 12. Then Esther told Hathach to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called me to come to him for 30 days. So Hathach gave Esther's message to Mordecai. Even the queen could not just go in and say, "Oh, hi king," or "Hi husband," who was a husband. Even she could not go in without an invitation. No one could go in without an invitation. And this was mainly for security, the security of the king, that nobody could just go in whenever they like. And so Esther sent this message back to Mordecai and said, "Well, I just can't go in. He hasn't called for 30 days. Who knows when? I can't do anything. My hands are tied." Okay, let's continue and read verse 13. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther: "Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all the other Jews are killed." So even though Esther had kept her nationality somewhat of a secret, Mordecai was still telling her, hey, don't think someone's not going to know. Don't think someone's not going to know, and that you will somehow escape what's going to happen. Okay, verse 14. "If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this." So it seems like Mordecai, he understood what was happening. And he understood that even if Esther did not do anything, God would have a plan B. God would have a plan B. But it seems like plan B would not be as good as plan A. He saw that this was the best chance. This was the best chance. But if Esther didn't do anything about it, then God would still do something. God would still do something. However, he said, you and your relatives still would die. So plan A was the best one in Mordecai's mind. Everyone would be saved. Whereas plan B, if Esther didn't, she might lose her life. Talk about piling pressure on a person. Ever been in a pressurized situation where you felt, no matter which option you take, it's not going to be good? This is what Mordecai was saying to Esther. Okay, you've got to do something. Okay, whether you like it or not, you've got to do something, or else, if you do nothing, you're going to die. But maybe others will live under the plan B. God's instruments may fail, but God does not. People might fail, we might fail, but God does not. And so he ends with those famous words, "Who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this?" And sometimes we're put in situations where it is our time to make a stand. It is our time to do the right thing. And that's what was Mordecai intimated to Esther. So although Esther was the queen of Media and Persia, she was still a Jew, and a secret Jew, and that under the instructions of her cousin Mordecai. Okay, cousin, sorry, not uncle. So what would she do? What would she do? Say nothing and let all her people be killed, hoping that she would be saved, relying on the fact that she was the queen after all. But it didn't work like that with the Medes and Persians. Once they made a rule and a law, it had to be followed. Okay. Should she expose the plot against her people before the king? Should she appeal to the king for help at the risk of her own life of going into the presence of the king? No easy options. No easy options for Queen Esther. Just a bit of a bracket here. The King George, who asked for the day of prayer, okay, he ruled from 1936 to 1952. In some ways, he was also an accidental monarch, just like Queen Esther. Queen Esther became queen basically from entering a beauty contest. It was more than a beauty contest. To be R-rated to describe what was really going on. So you can read it yourself. So she was a bit of an accidental queen. King George VI, who was the king during World War II, was also an accidental monarch. He only became king because his brother abdicated. Okay, his brother, who was King Edward VIII, he abdicated in December 1936 and gave up the throne. So in normal course of events, King George would not have been king for maybe many, many years, and then only maybe, but only because his brother abdicated. He was a conscientious and dedicated man, and he worked hard to adapt to his role that he was suddenly thrust in. He was reserved by nature, and he was also a man of deep religious belief. And that's possibly where Queen Elizabeth, who just passed away recently, was also noted for her religious belief, possibly through her family and through her father, King George, the sixth, that she got this religious spirituality. One of his greatest achievements of King George was during the Second World War, where he remained at Buckingham Palace even during the Blitz. And Buckingham Palace was actually bombed about 9 times during the Blitz, yet he stayed mainly in that palace. Not always, but mainly. He didn't go overseas or anything like that. The palace was bombed 9 times, and he and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, not the one who just passed away, visited severely bombed areas in the east of London and elsewhere in the country. And so he gained great popularity of being the monarch who was with his people during the war. The king developed a close working relationship with his wartime Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, as most of Europe fell to Nazi Germany. So he was also a little bit of an accidental monarch and also a believing monarch as well. And so this video is actually his appeal for the National Day of Prayer, how he approached it.
At this fateful hour we turn, as our fathers before us have turned in all times of trial, to God Most High. Here in the old country, I have asked that Sunday next should be observed as a day of national prayer. It may be possible for many of our brothers overseas to join their prayers with ours. Let us, with one heart and soul, humbly but confidently commit our cause to God and ask His aid that we may valiantly defend the right as it is given to us to see it. So now, the peoples of the empire, the men and women in all quarters of the globe, I say to you, put into your task, whatever it may be, all of the courage and purpose of which you are capable. Keep your heart proud and your resolve unshaken. And let us go forward to that task as one man, a smile on our lips and our heads held high. And with God's help, we shall not fail.
Very interesting, isn't it? He called for the people to come humbly before God at this very desperate time during the World War II. And so that's how he handled his call to prayer for the people of England. Okay, now let's go back to Esther. Okay, Esther's got these big decisions. Mordecai's piling on the pressure. Okay, Esther chapter 4:15 to 17. 4:15 to 17. Okay, so just after Mordecai has said, who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this. Verse 15. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go and gather all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die." So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered. She doesn't mention prayer and she doesn't mention God. Even King George VI mentioned prayer and mentioned God, but here in the Bible, in this book, there is no mention of God whatsoever, or mention of prayer. Now, obviously, it's alluded to because she talks about fasting. Now, if you're going to fast, well, what else are you going to do except praying as well? So prayer is certainly alluded to, no question, but it's not mentioned, and God's name is not mentioned. So very unusual what is going on. And she uses prayer not to escape what she has to do, but to do what she has to do, to go and see the king. The last quarter, we were looking at crucibles and trials in our lives. And when we're going through hard times, we want to get out pretty quickly. We want to get out as soon as possible. And her prayer was not to get out of it. Her prayer was not about, well, let's have fasting and prayer and hopefully there'll be another way. But instead it was to do what she knew she had to do. Sometimes we need to be fortified to do what we need to do. Because she says, "I will go and see the king." So at the end of the 3 days, I will go and see the king. So she wasn't praying for a way out. She wasn't praying for a shortcut, a bit like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Okay? If it's possible, take this away. If not, your will be done. Here, she doesn't even ask for it to be taken away. She simply prays, okay, pray and fast for me, then I'll go in and do what I need to do. That's how it is sometimes with us as well. We know what we ought to do. But we just need that extra courage or whatever, rather than praying to God to take away what we need to do, but to pray for the courage to do what we need to do. And so Esther asked people throughout the land to have prayer and fasting, even though prayer is not mentioned. We can assume that that's exactly what she wanted to do. So yeah, sometimes we've got to do what's right, no matter what the consequences, and that's what we see here. We see this later on as well, in the New Testament as well. Let's go to Acts 4:29-31. Doesn't refer to Esther, but certainly to the same spirit as Esther. Acts chapter 4:29-31. Acts chapter 4:29-31. Okay, and this is when some of the leaders were being threatened not to preach. Okay, don't preach anymore. Okay, don't do that. Don't do that. Let's have a look what they prayed. Acts chapter 4:29-31. After this prayer, the meeting place shook, and they were all filled with the Holy Spirit. Then they preached the words with, jumping again, 29, beginning there. You can tell I haven't preached for a while, can't you? "And now, O Lord, hear their threats, and give us, your servants, great boldness in preaching your word. Stretch out your hand with healing power. May miraculous signs and wonders be done through the name of your holy servant Jesus." After this prayer, the meeting place shook, and they were all filled with the Holy Spirit. Then they preached the word of God with boldness. They were threatened, do not preach. But they knew they had to preach. They knew they had to spread the word. And so they prayed that they would have boldness to preach, to do what they needed to do. They didn't pray, let's go somewhere else or whatever. They preached for boldness. We've got to do this. We've got to do this. And so they prayed for boldness, and then they preached with boldness. And so that's what Esther did. She didn't pray for a way out. She prayed she would do what she knew she had to do. Prayerful action. Prayerful action. As I say, the title is Informed Prayer and Prayerful Action. Divine power is united with human effort. This means the means used are human, but the deliverance itself is divine. Both together we see here in Esther. Sometimes we need to pray for strength to do what we know that we do need to do, rather than for the trial to be taken away from us. Mark Twain said, "Courage is the mastery of fear, not the absence of fear." Pretty good, isn't it? Courage is the mastery of fear, not the absence of fear. And so after informed prayer, the next part came, prayerful action. Let's go back to Esther chapter 5, verses 1 to 3. Esther chapter 5, verses 1 to 3. Fifth chapter of Esther, verses 1 to 3. On the third day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out the gold scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. Then the king asked her, "What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half of the kingdom." And so Esther went in, even though it was against the law. After the people and everyone had prayer and fasting, she then went into the court and did what she had to do. And we're not looking into all of it, but maybe I just thought of it later about her request for the king was actually to go to a banquet. Maybe because after 3 days of fasting, she was hungry. So the first thing she thought about was, let's eat. But anyway, after 2 banquets with the king, she told the king about the plot. And so the king, who under the laws of the Medes and Persians, he couldn't take away the law about murdering all the Jews, but he did pass another law that the Jews could defend themselves on that day. And so it was a happy ending for all. It was a happy ending for all. And so Esther did what she had to do. She did what she had to do. Informed prayer. Informed prayer was, give me strength to do what I have to do. But then followed the prayerful action of following through what she must do. Informed prayer and then prayerful action as well. And so in some ways, this reminds us of what will be happening at the end of time as well. Let's go to Revelation 12:17. Esther is a type of what we see in the prophecies of Revelation. Revelation chapter 12:17 and chapter 13 verses 14 and 15. Revelation chapter 12 and verse 17 and chapter 13, 14 to 15, verse 14 to 15. Chapter 12 and verse 17. And the dragon was angry at the woman and declared war against the rest of her children, all who keep God's commandments and maintain their testimony for Jesus. So here we see war against God's people, just as Haman had war against God's people. And then chapter 13, verses 14 and 15, it says, and with all the miracles he was allowed to perform on behalf of the first beast, he deceived all the people who belonged to the world, to this world. He ordered the people to make a great statue of the first beast who was fatally wounded and then came back to life. He was then permitted to give life to this statue so that it could speak. And then the statue of the beast commanded that anyone refusing to worship it must die. So at the end of the time, there'll be a death decree as well. Be a death decree against the people who keep God's commandments, including, of course, the seventh-day Sabbath commandment is included as well. And so what was happening in the life of Esther and the Jews is a type of what is also going to be happening at the end of time as well. So I'm actually going to be writing a bit of a sermon series on Esther and what we can learn from all the things that's happening, because there was many parallels. Today was just an overview, because it was more about prayer. But the book of Esther has many things to teach us. It's almost as important, I'd suggest, as the book of Daniel in understanding end times. Anyway, we'll see. We'll see next year. The dragon Satan is enraged against the woman, which is the church, and he makes war against her offspring, those who obey the commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. There's a death decree, just like we see in the book of Esther. And so Satan is enraged. And so, like Esther, we will have to stand firm. We will have to stand firm and go against the laws as well. That will also be what is happening. And so, lessons from Esther, today, from today's sermon, we need to pray for the courage to do what is right sometimes. Not just to take us out of the trial, but to do what is right in the trial. We sometimes need to do something to be part of the fulfillment of God's plan. Okay, they had to do something. Couldn't just leave it all up to God. They had to do something. Okay, preparation for doing right now, for doing right in the end times, begins with doing what is right now. Okay, what we need to do right at the end, at the very end, we need to be doing right now as well. And so, some good lessons here just from this very, very brief part of Esther. And there's, of course, many other chapters as well, which I'll be looking at about the life of Esther and what she went through and the Jewish people went through is a type of what we will also go through as well. Just like to close with a poem, Do the Right. Courage, believer, do not stumble, though your path be dark as night. There's a star to guide the humble, trust in God and do the right. Perish policy and cunning, perish all that fears the light. Whether losing, whether winning, trust in God and do the right. Some will hate you, some will love you, some will flatter, some will slight. Cease from man and look above you. Trust in God and do the right. Now have our closing hymn, Sweet Hour of Prayer. Let's bow our heads in prayer. Dear Father, thank you that we can come to you whenever we are in trials, whenever we know we have to do the right thing, but maybe there'll be consequences for it, Father. Thank you for the example of Esther in this situation, who asked her people to pray for her and fast for her, Father. Thank you, Father, that you're a God who hears and a God who listens and a God who answers prayer. We're thankful, Father, during that time in World War II for a praying king who called his people to prayer at a desperate time when the nation was looking to you to help, and you delivered the troops from the evils of the Nazi regime. Dear Father, I pray that we'll be encouraged to always come to you and always to follow you and do what is right. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.